Hi, good evening, and welcome to the fifth event of the 2022 Digger Debate Series, and our final event before the primary election on August 9th. My name is Mike Doherty, and I'm a senior editor at VTDigger. Tonight, we're really excited to hear from two candidates looking to become Vermont's next Attorney General. Tonight's debate is sponsored by the Necrason Group. Necrason Group is a top-ranked Vermont government affairs and communications firm serving clients working on issues important to those who work, do business, and live in Vermont. This debate is also made possible by you. VTDigger is a nonprofit news organization powered by our contributing members. To help support the journalism we do and the debates we host, please visit vtdigger.org/donate. Before I introduce the candidates and moderators, I'd like to briefly outline the format and rules of this debate. Candidates will have the opportunity to deliver brief opening remarks before facing questions from our moderators. Candidates will generally have 90 seconds to respond. The moderators may pose brief follow-up questions or allow another candidate to respond if named. Twice tonight, we will turn over the questioning to the candidates themselves. Each will have the opportunity to pose a question to their opponent. Finally, we expect to end with a lightning round, during which the candidates will answer questions in just a few words. A quick technical note, closed captions are available by clicking the CC button on your video player. These captions are automatically generated and may contain some errors. I now have the pleasure of introducing our candidates and moderators. Joining us tonight are two Democratic candidates for Attorney General. Charity Clark served as an Assistant Attorney General in Vermont for the past 7 years, including 4 years as Chief of Staff. Rory Tebow has served as State's Attorney in Washington County since 2018. I'll note that VTDigger is not holding debates for the Republican or progressive primaries for Attorney General because only one candidate has entered each of those races. Finally, I'd like to introduce our moderators for the evening, VTDigger reporters Sarah Meerhoff and Alan Keyes. Sarah and Alan, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. We'll begin this evening with opening statements from the candidates. While introducing yourselves to voters, please tell us what experience you have that prepares you to serve as Vermont's next Attorney General and how that experience differentiates you from your opponent. First, we'll go to Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Sarah. My story begins in southern Vermont, where I grew up working in my family's grocery store, starting from the time I was 10. I worked my last day when I was in law school, and I stocked shelves, I ran the cash register, and I saw all kinds of people. I saw people thriving, people struggling, people on their way to work. And when I grew up, I took those experiences with me when I became a lawyer, but especially these last 8 years, almost 8 years, working at the Attorney General's office. The last 4 years, I served as Chief of Staff. And as a part of the leadership team of the Attorney General's office, I was a part of decision-making on all of the major issues that face the Attorney General's office, whether it be consumer, environmental, or criminal. When I made those decisions and when I was doing that work, I always tried to lead, keeping in mind that everyday Vermonter I encountered so many times growing up in southern Vermont, working in my family's store. For 13 years, I worked as an attorney in private practice or as an assistant attorney general, but it is these last 4 years serving as chief of staff that put me in a role that is most similar to the attorney general and prepared me best to be the next attorney general. I believe we need an attorney general with the understanding of the breadth and scope of the office to leverage the office for the best results for Vermont and for Vermonters, and I will be ready to lead on day one.
Thank you. Mr. Tebow, you next.
Well, good evening, and Sarah, Alan, thank you for having us, and Charity, it's great to see you this evening. I'm joining you from Cabot, where I live with my wife, Joanna, and my sons, River and Cody. Since 2018, I have served as the Washington County State's Attorney. My life in Cabot and my upbringing guide my values and priorities. I grew up in a blue-collar union household. I attended college because I was able to earn an Army ROTC scholarship. And then I went on to Vermont Law School, where I met my wife and launched my professional career. In Cabot, my wife, Joanna, is a small business owner. She's co-owner of Cabot's historic Harry's Hardware. I've served on our local school board since 2017, and in that role, I helped my community navigate Act 46, authored our school's diversity, equity, inclusivity policy, and supported our students when they raised the Black Lives Matter flag and Pride flag on our campus. I put on a suit when I go to Barrie and Montpelier to do my day job, but I'm much more comfortable in jeans or shorts here in Cabot, whether it's on the farm with my cows and sheep, whether it's on the athletic field as a father and youth soccer coach, or whether it's just walking through town, speaking with fellow veterans or other friends in this small community. My entire career has been in public service. First working with the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee in DC, then an 8-year journey with the US Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, called JAG for short, or as JAG officer as it may be. Since 2016, I've served the state of Vermont exclusively. First as a deputy state's attorney, then as an assistant attorney general, and finally as the state's attorney. I'm an experienced litigator, and I'm equally comfortable in court or in the State House committee rooms advocating for change. My life and professional experiences have taught me that we need to be proactive in facing all of our challenges. A proactive approach is what Vermonters expect of an attorney general as we face an unprecedented period in history where we have a hostile Supreme Court and fundamental rights and threats to our democracy emerge every day. As Attorney General, I will use my experiences and perspective to lead the way on achieving a 21st century criminal justice system. That's one that's rooted in empathy, equity, and transparency. We need to build that on the foundation of sentence reform, harm reduction, and restorative practices. We also need to commit now more than ever to defending our democracy and fundamental rights against a radicalized Supreme Court and right-wing extremism that threatens every aspect of our lives as we know it here in Vermont. We also need to promote environmental justice. The legislature did a great thing in passing Vermont's first environmental justice policy, but there's more to that. We have to have an attorney general willing to aggressively use the state's legal process to achieve our climate goals. We have to confront the challenge ahead of us, whether it's expanding our own renewable energy capacity or making sure that we don't build a green economy on the backs of Vermont's working class. And finally, we need to remain focused on public safety. The Attorney General's most critical role in the state of Vermont is that of being the chief law enforcement officer. As an experienced public servant and active prosecutor covering the state's capital, I have the experience and know-how to tackle issues, whether it is gun safety, school safety, or responding to and prioritizing the state's response to domestic and sexual violence. Ultimately, Vermonters need, expect, and deserve seasoned leadership, decisive action, and experience.
Thank you. We'll now turn to questions for each of the candidates, some of which were submitted by VTDigger readers. You'll each have 90 seconds to answer the questions and reserve the right to ask follow-up questions, which should be answered in no more than 30 seconds. The first question is, among the Attorney General's duties is investigating law enforcement officers in cases involving use of force, including the use of deadly force. Do you believe Vermont's laws and protocols surrounding these investigations do enough to hold police accountable? If not, what would you propose to change? Ms. Clark?
Thank you, Ellen. As a member of the leadership team of the Attorney General's Office as Chief of Staff for 4 years, I was involved in several reviews and decisions that needed to be made with regards to police use of force. Those are incredibly challenging cases. They're incredibly important cases. All people in Vermont deserve to feel safe and to be safe. And I take that incredibly seriously, as I did when I was the Chief of Staff. Right now, we have a practice where both a state's attorney and the attorney general review those cases. And I think that's a good practice to have both offices do the review. Formalizing that is not a bad idea. I think that I would definitely support that. It's a really difficult issue, but I think for now, I think it's working in terms of the process of the review. I know that it can be challenging for everyone involved, but I don't think I would change the process of the review. We did in 2020, I believe, change the standard of review, and that went into place, I believe, last year. So it's been about a year that new standard has been in place, and I think it's probably early still to see if any additional changes need to be made to that. But I wanted to flag that change was made last year.
Akiva?
I'll start by saying I disagree. I don't think the system is working. I don't think Vermonters have confidence in how our law enforcement or prosecutorial agencies are responding to the review of officer-involved shootings. But law enforcement accountability is more than just those investigations, which are incredibly difficult to work through. One thing I would promise to improve is increasing or reducing the time in which it takes to process that. We've had to wait at times 6 to 9 months for the Attorney General's office to complete a review that state's attorneys have completed in 60 to 90 days. That's unacceptable for the individuals who have suffered a loss. It's unacceptable for law enforcement who hangs in the balance. It's time for us to revisit Act 56. Act 56 in 2017 gave the Training Council a lot of power for decertification, and yet we still see bad cops out there every day. We don't have a standardized system for tracking integrity issues. Instead, we rely on the ACLU database and Vermont Digger public record request to shine a spotlight on this for the public. The Attorney General and the state's attorney should have the ability to directly refer officers for decertification. We also need to consider whether or not there needs to be a special prosecutor assigned to handle these cases to ensure that there is truly impartiality, and that should be coupled with the ability to have an effective internal affairs program for the small municipal departments spread throughout the state.
There's been legislation in the legislature that talked about establishing a database for officers with credibility issues, the so-called Brady letters, who have received them due to allegations of misconduct. Do you support making these records of these incidents available to the public? And what else should the Attorney General's office do to track these incidents and address public misconduct? Mr. Tebow?
Well, first, I think that I'd like to just note that my office is right now the only prosecutorial agency in the state that has actually put out a thorough and complete policy on how to handle Brady and Giglio letters, or the so-called scarlet letters for law enforcement. The Attorney General's office had the opportunity to do this and provide leadership. They did not. Likewise, I'm disappointed in other SAs not doing that, but there should be an easy way to track this information, because we can't have a bad officer leaving Brattleboro and ending up in St. Albans without anyone knowing about it. That erodes public trust and confidence in law enforcement, and it really impacts then the good officers who are working with integrity and consistent with public values to meet and reach their goals. We can't get through justice reform without doing something decisive to restore public confidence and trust in law enforcement, both at the local and the statewide level. So I would support what you've proposed, which is a statewide database, so that this information is out there for all Vermonters to see. Vermonters deserve to know who is working in their law enforcement agencies.
Ms. Clark?
Thanks for the question. And I really appreciate Rory's leadership on this. I think it's an incredibly important issue. I think this is one of many issues related to police reform and police conduct that is in flux. And we, as not just a state, but as a country, are at a moment in time when it's good to be evaluating how we handle things with regards to police. I think that's an expectation that we have, that we will be doing those evaluations, and this is certainly in that category. I have been thinking lately about one particular issue related to police training that I think relates to try to really prevent some of the challenges that we see in the police arena, and that is with regards to where how our training facility handles particularly the paramilitary style of our training, and how folks who are being trained are required to sleep overnight. I think that is, there's a better way of doing that. It acts as a barrier to folks who have families and can't pursue a career in police. I think a location that was located in a more populous area than a rural area that didn't require that overnight stay and took into account all the various, social work and, drug addiction issues, victim rights, all of that would really do a lot for morale and for recruitment. So, just want to flag that for training. Specifically with Rory's idea, I would be interested in taking a look at that in January and seeing if that is something that the Attorney General should also adopt. And thanks again for your leadership on that, Rory.
Thank you.
Our next question is in regards to the U.S. Supreme Court's recent decision on federal abortion protections. Since the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade, some states where abortion is now illegal have begun discussing plans to prosecute people who cross state lines to obtain an abortion in a state like Vermont, where the procedure is still legal. As Attorney General, would you cooperate with out-of-state investigations of patients who travel to Vermont to obtain an abortion? Why or why not? First, we'll go to Ms. Clark.
I believe that the Dobbs decision was an affront to our personal freedoms and the right to a bodily autonomy that we hold dear here in Vermont. It personally affects me as a woman. I'm offended. I am dismayed. I will do everything in my power as Attorney General to make sure that Vermont can be a safe harbor to not just people who are seeking an abortion, but also protecting providers here in Vermont who are assisting with an abortion. I released a plan that detailed some of the ideas that I had regarding making Vermont a safe harbor. And those include, in the criminal arena, like this question asked regarding cooperation, and also in the consumer arena and in the administrative arena. I think it's important that we take advantage of not just the criminal area, but the other many divisions in the Attorney General's office to, leverage our ability to make sure that Vermont becomes that safe harbor. We have an opportunity this November to enshrine in our Constitution the right to an abortion. I believe passionately that we should be doing that. And in the meantime, we should be working with the legislature on implementing the elements of my plan to ensure that Vermont does everything it can to continue our value of personal freedom and bodily autonomy.
Thanks, Ms. Clark. I appreciate that you came out with your plan in regards to the Dobbs decision, but for those watching tonight, can you just specify, would you cooperate with those out-of-state investigations?
No.
No, thank you. Mr. Tebow, you next.
So I would not cooperate, and I think we have a roadmap on how to do this successfully in the state of Vermont. Vermont's fair and impartial policing policy has been adapted as a response to make sure that Vermont's values are protected when dealing with questions of federal civil immigration enforcement. There are means by which we can avoid helping or assisting other hostile states or jurisdictions. I think it's also critically important, as Charity mentioned, we need to make sure Prop 5 is passed and enshrined as a constitutional protection for Vermonters and those who are here in the state of Vermont. We need to make sure that, as I would agree that we need to make sure that the Attorney General's office is not siloed by division, but rather there's an all hands on deck approach to make sure that we are not complicit in punishing or criminalizing people seeking safe harbor in Vermont, whether that is someone seeking abortion access or whether it's a provider taking refuge in the state of Vermont. We need to use every power we have in the state to defend those individuals. Likewise, the legislature needs to act in this session to adopt robust data protection policies and procedures. We need to make sure that protected health information, particularly with respect to reproductive liberties, is not subject to a foreign jurisdiction, being another state, by their search warrants or that they can act on it. We need to make sure that the data privacy of Vermonters is held as sacrosanct when it comes to reproductive liberties, as is their right to abortion access and healthcare.
Thank you. Next question. Republican leaders have also raised the possibility of instituting a federal abortion ban should Republicans take back Congress and the White House. If that were to occur, would you as Attorney General continue to defend abortion access in Vermont in defiance of a federal ban? How? Mr. Tebow, you first.
I'll start by saying, of course, the rule of law is a really important principle, and there can be a time where there's a tough conflict between doing what we believe truly is right and what's consistent with Vermont values versus what a hostile federal government or radicalized judiciary forces us to do. I think the only correct answer here for any Democratic politician is fight to the bitter end, using every legal means necessary and appropriate to stop that reality. I think Vermont needs to get creative right now and start assuming that in 2 years, we will not have the luxury of a Democratic White House or a Democratic Congress in Washington, D.C. I think we need to be looking at ways in which we can secure a pipeline of Plan B and other medical implements or pharmaceutical agents that do not cross interstate commerce, or that we can regulate or create here in Vermont. We need to make sure that we are doing anything possible to join with other states in fighting this. And whether that means lawsuits in federal court or it means regionalizing an approach to how to deal with a hostile government on this matter. We can't sacrifice Vermont women or those with the uterus for for the sake of a right-wing extremism in the courts or in the legislature.
Ms. Clark?
Not surprisingly, Rory and I are both Democrats, and I think we, share a policy view on this point. I want to spend my time just contrasting a difference between us. Vermont has never elected a woman attorney general. I would be the first woman elected. And I want to tell you about this conference room in the attorney general's office. And the conference room has on display the portraits of all of the past attorneys general. And every single one of them is 26, they're men, and 27 once Attorney General Donovan's portrait is added. It's very jarring. And with this issue in particular, I think it's incredibly important to notice the difference of the lived experience that I have had. When the Dobbs decision came out, this affected me personally. A right was stripped from me personally. I, as Attorney General, will fight as hard as possible to ensure, under all circumstances, just like the ones that Sarah described, that Vermont remains the safe harbor that we can be, and that our values of bodily autonomy and personal freedom are protected here in Vermont.
A common tactic of the previous Attorney General was to sign on to multi-state amicus briefs submitted by like-minded attorney generals across the country on a range of issues. Do you think these multi-state amicus briefs have been effective? Are they an ideal use of the office's time? Ms. Clark?
Yes, I do. The Attorney General's office has 150 employees across 7 divisions. I'm always impressed in Vermont, state government and small businesses with the amount we can do with not that much. What multi-state lawsuits enable us to do is even more with not that much. We can be one voice joining together with like-minded states to file lawsuits and comment letters and amicus briefs. What we get in return is often, millions of dollars. I'm going to use an example. The tobacco settlement, which occurred in 1998 and has brought the state of Vermont every year, it's at least $20 million for 10 years because we were a member of the leadership team on that. It was $30 million. That was really a multi-state effort. The opioids cases, it really goes on and on. We've also signed on to a lot of environmental sign-ons with like-minded states. So I think that's, it's a very good use of our time. We get to leverage what we have for more. And I think it also is helpful to have that kind of collaboration with like-minded states to see what they're doing. Maybe we could be doing better, or we can share our ideas with them. I think it's a really good thing. As Attorney General, I would prioritize those relationships and make sure that Vermont's voice was heard on the national level.
Mr. Tebow?
So I'll start by saying I think a lot of states look to Vermont for leadership. We're viewed as a liberal, common sense state that gets results. Whether that's Bernie Sanders on the national stage or Patrick Leahy or Peter Welch, we've been well represented in Washington, D.C. There's no reason why Vermont can't be a leader on issues in the court system as well. But there are limits to what we have available. The resources of the Attorney General of a small state like Vermont are not infinite. And I think it is a wise course of action to join with larger states on these large multi-state suits against polluting corporations or against people who present a danger to Vermont, whether it's opiates or chemicals. So the judicious use of resources, I think, is something to be applauded, whether during the Donovan administration or the Sorrell administration. Vermont has certainly benefited from being a solid partner to like-minded states on these matters, and that is a policy I would look to continue. With that said, I think Vermont is going to have some unique opportunities to provide leadership. We are leaning forward more than other states when it comes to getting to a green economy and seeking climate justice. We are leaning forward and are going to be a leader on standing up for reproductive rights. These are the areas, especially if Prop 5 is added to our Constitution, where Vermont may have unique laws, skills, and expertise to push back against a hostile federal judiciary. So I hope that we can continue to work with other states, but occasionally take the lead as well.
Thank you both. We'll now provide an opportunity for candidates to ask one another questions. Each candidate may ask another candidate of their choosing. I guess you won't be choosing, there's 2 of you. One question. These should be questions, not speeches. You'll have 90 seconds to answer. We may ask a follow-up or allow your colleague to ask a follow-up. First, Mr. Tebow.
So I'll start by saying the tenure of Attorney General Donovan was generally a good one, but it wasn't without controversy. In some of the media interviews leading up to this debate, you've stated that the system is working well the way it is concerning the relationship between the criminal division of the Attorney General's office and state's attorneys. In light of criticisms of the Attorney General's handling of threats against lawmakers, transparency with the public, and the time it has taken to review officer-involved shootings, what would you do differently?
What would I do differently with regards to the relationship between the state's attorneys and the Attorney General's office?
Well, and especially with a focus on those issues, the threats to lawmakers, transparency with the public, and the review of officer-involved shootings.
Okay. So let me begin by saying I believe transparency is fundamental, and it kind of is what makes our state government work so well. I think in Vermont, we have an expectation that not only will our government be transparent to us, but we have a close proximity to our elected officials. You know, you walk down Church Street in Burlington and you can run into Bernie Sanders, right? This has happened to some of us. It certainly happened to me. I love that about Vermont, and I would absolutely continue with that ethos and that philosophy as Attorney General. I appreciate the question. What I have experienced working at the Attorney General's office, and especially as Chief of Staff for 4 years, is a collaborative mindset when there's overlap with the state's attorneys. So I'm interested to hear your perspective. It's not one that I observed a lot. What I saw was a lot of conversations and collaboration. I'm going to give just one example because I did happen to be personally involved with it, and that is with our expungement clinics. We ran expungement clinics, and we always partnered with local state's attorneys at the prosecutorial level, at the county level. And I think those worked very smoothly. And I always felt like we had good relationships. If there is feedback from the state's attorneys that I'm hearing, as Attorney General, I would of course address that and work to resolve the specific challenges that existed, but also just make sure the communication lines were open. You know, I would absolutely call a meeting and have those conversations to make sure that folks knew that they had access to the Attorney General. That transparency shouldn't just be for the public, of course, it should be for all of the state's attorneys. And I see my time is up, so I didn't really get to your officer-involved shooting question. Sorry about that.
Mr. Tebow, would you like to ask a follow-up question?
So I guess this would be the time with the officer-involved shooting. So,
Okay.
you know, sometimes it's taken an extended period of time for the Attorney General's office to announce a decision. And also, unlike many of the state's attorney's offices, the Attorney General's office has declined to provide the full legal memorandum reviewing facts and its legal conclusions. Would you change that practice?
No, with officer-involved shootings, one of the reasons why, I don't know if these are the reasons in the cases that you have in mind, but as you know, a lot goes into an investigation evaluation in an officer-involved shooting situation. And oftentimes there is an expert involved. And sometimes we can't control the experts outside of the office, and we can't control their time frame. So I know that is a reason. I'm aware of that in the past. You're right, that is a very long time, and I would certainly be disinclined to use an expert that took that much time, that was holding up a case. And I agree with you completely. It's much too long to have an officer and a victim, everyone waiting to hear what the outcome is. So I agree with you that that's too long. In terms of the process, I think that there is an opportunity to be transparent, and we always have to be transparent as much as we can. But particularly when the officer is found, there's no charge. I don't know that it's appropriate to release that legal memorandum to the public generally. I think protecting the privacy of the officer is a consideration that I think that's where my instinct would be on that question.
Thank you. Just a reminder for follow-up questions, if we could please keep those answers to 30 seconds, that would be wonderful. Ms. Clark, what is your question for Mr. Tebow?
So my question is, as Chief of Staff at the Attorney General's office, I led the Consumer Assistance Program, which makes contact with 15,000 Vermonters each year. If elected, what is your plan for helping Vermont consumers?
So I think the Consumer Assistance Program is really one of the most forward-facing aspects of the Attorney General's office. It's been incredibly successful, and I think there's more we can do with it. You know, the Office of the Attorney General only has one victim advocate on staff. If elected, I'd like to create a client services division of at least 3 individuals working across divisions, not just the criminal division, to really help with people who have an issue or need to interact with the Attorney General's office, whether they're a victim or just somebody inquiring for help. I also think that we're overdue to see leadership on reforming some of Vermont's laws. Most of our laws dealing with white collar crime or scams date back 30, 40 years. They don't even contemplate the internet. You know, if you want to get a headache, go and read our false pretense statute. It makes reference to all kinds of archaic instruments and things that are never used in commerce any longer. So I think we can serve consumers well by looking holistically at the entire system and building in and reforming to make sure that we have laws that are enforceable with teeth and that are relevant to the types of scams people are seeing now, whether by internet or by some phone means. Ultimately, the good work of that program needs to feed into active work and prosecution. I would also like to see capacity built in local law enforcement to do more follow-up on these more localized scams. I've seen a woeful lack of capacity to deal with sometimes the many subpoenas, search warrants, and the long time period it takes to build a financial exploitation case or a home improvement fraud case. So while the program is, I think, a high point for the Attorney General's office, there's more we can be doing.
Ms. Clark, do you have a follow-up to that?
Yes. All of those ideas related to criminal law. And I'm wondering if you have anything specific that you think the Attorney General's Consumer Assistance Program can be doing just exclusively with consumer law or in the consumer space.
Sure. So, I think that accessibility is a big thing. Just as much as there are clinics dealing with expungement, this is something that can be pushed localized instead of just a hotline. I think one of the complaints or commentaries I've heard on the campaign trail when I'm in places like Bennington or St. Albans or Bellows Falls is people don't see or hear a lot from statewide offices or office holders unless it's election time. I think it's really important that we make sure that there is reach and that these services are accessible to people in rural areas or pockets of the state that are off of Interstate 89.
Thank you. We'll have another round of candidate questions in a bit. But for now, we'll return to questions for each of you. For Ms. Clark, many records related to the EB5 scandal that played out at JP have been kept under wraps by the Attorney General's office for years, ever since a litigation hold had been put in place by former Attorney General Bill Sorrell and continued on by Attorney General T.J. Donovan as lawsuits remain pending. How can the Attorney General's office be considered transparent when for years it has blocked the release of these documents? How can the public properly judge whether the actions of state officials were appropriate without having access to the full record?
As I said, I believe firmly in transparency, and I think it's incredibly important. I worked on our public records work when I was Chief of Staff at the Attorney General's office these past 4 years. That said, the Attorney General is the lawyer to the state. And when the state gets sued, is the Attorney General who represents the state in that lawsuit. And with EB5, that is certainly the case. That case has been going on for a very long time, has a lot of years behind it. But every lawyer is required under the ethical rules to zealously represent their client. And part of what is at play in a case like EB5 in a civil lawsuit and any work that we do is attorney-client privilege. And we have tension between this value of transparency and the value and the ethical obligation that we have with attorney-client privilege. If the client,
Go ahead, sorry.
Okay. If the client does not wish to release the records, they don't have to. And that is a value that is incredibly important, I would say fundamental to our legal system here in the United States. And I certainly would continue to honor that wish as Attorney General. That said, there is a plan in place to release those records when the lawsuit is over. And I absolutely will adhere to that plan and make sure that those the plan is put in place once the lawsuit is completed.
How can the public properly judge whether the actions of state officials were appropriate without having access to the full record? It's now been several years.
Yeah, and when the case is over, there's a plan in place to reveal those records, and then the public will have that opportunity.
Which case?
Well, any case, but specific, you asked about EB-5, so that's specifically in regards to EB-5, but yeah.
So it's the civil litigation regarding EB-5?
That's what the state's handling, the civil litigation.
Mr. Tebow, do you agree with the approach taken to the release of the EB-5 records under Attorney General Donovan? If not, what would you have done differently?
I respect the notion of attorney-client privilege, but I think there are some things that would put dents in that argument. I think it's disappointing that we've learned more about the acts, omissions, and failures of Vermont state government officials from defense sentencing filings in federal court and intrepid journalists, for what it's worth. We have kind of lurched through as a state government trying to adopt ethics rules and react to EB-5 without even understanding the full scope of what those failures were in state government. I'm particularly concerned about withholding documents that have already been disclosed in either federal court or public someplace else. There's no reason to continue withholding those records when they've already been made public in one way or another. Instead, we're just adding another layer of bureaucracy or another barrier for a Vermonter to access it and assess those records. One thing that I think would be different, I see a profound need for the Attorney General's office to have a chief information officer. Recently, I was contacted by a very senior attorney in the office on a public records issue, and I couldn't believe that she was being asked to handle public records requests, well beyond the scope of her talent and skills. Not to say public records aren't important, but that's not something that we need to be having one of our sharpest legal minds dealing with instead of working on cases. So I think there needs to be a refresh on transparency and a new model adopted that really focuses on making documents accessible to the public and not categorically claiming privilege over things that the public ought to have a right to know.
On this topic of public records, Ms. Clark, do you support the establishment of a state public records ombudsman? If so, what authority should they have to release records that have previously been denied by a state agency?
What I would advocate for instead of an ombudsman is an officer. I would advocate for a public records officer that would not handle all the public records requests that every agency gets, but would rather serve as a policy setting policy for statewide. Because right now we have each department sets their own policies, and there's a lot of leeway there. And people, the public, the press, they all have different experiences depending on the department that they're seeking records from. So that officer could set the policy for the office and have more uniformity. That officer also could handle appeals. And I think that would be really useful so that there was an outside person handling the appeals from the department who made the initial response. And then the next step after the appeal, of course, is court. But not that I'm against an ombudsman, I think it's a good idea, but I think a better idea is a public records officer.
Mr. Tebow?
I think the notion of an ombudsman or somebody who is independent with the goal of transparency would be helpful in state government. There are definitely a lot of different record management and retention policies throughout state government, but ultimately issues, I think, befall the appeal process. It shouldn't be an automatic go to the Superior Court and demand records through legal process. We need to have a better system. I don't think most Vermonters want to spend the time or money litigating in Superior Court against the state's best attorneys just to get records that they feel they're entitled to.
Thank you both. You'll have 90 seconds for this next question. The Global Warming Solutions Act was passed into law over Governor Scott's veto. This year, Scott also vetoed the most significant recommendation from the Vermont Climate Council, the Clean Heat Standard, which was designed to help meet Vermont's pollution reduction requirements under the Act. What would you do to ensure that the Scott administration follows the law in meeting the now legally binding emissions reduction requirements established by the Global Warming Solutions Act? First, Mr. Tebow, please.
So I have real concern that we're already behind the curve on where we need to be on this. And the role of the Attorney General needs to be really the state's counsel and perhaps the skunk at the party, if you will, who points out all the bad and negative consequences that happen for inaction, not just from a broad and global sense of if we sit back and do nothing to meet these goals, but rather the legal peril that we put the state in, the cost of litigation, and I think more than anything else, the damage that will come to the reputation of this government, this legislature, and the administration for inaction. Vermonters are demanding decisive action on climate. So the main role I see for the Attorney General is to continually point out in every setting, whether it's a study committee or whether it's a meeting with the Secretary of Administration or the governor, him or herself, to point out what the consequences of failure in action are. At the more holistic and lower level, I think that there is a more active role that the Attorney General's office can play, both in terms of looking for opportunities to intervene in Public Utility Commission cases, or looking at ways in which we can streamline the process for citing solar arrays and renewable energy in the state. Functionally, it's impossible to build a new wind generation station in Vermont. And as a recent commentary in your publication noted, it should not be easier to build a Dollar General in Vermont than it is to build new solar capacity.
Ms. Clark?
This is one of my primary issues in my campaign. One of the things I'm focusing on, I believe really passionately in the importance of our natural environment, and global warming is a huge existential crisis of our time. For me, I have been involved since the beginning of the Global Warming Solutions Act, because as Chief of Staff at the Attorney General's office this past 4 years, I oversaw our legislative work. And, as you know, the governor vetoed that. It was overridden by one vote. We were involved with testifying and, making public statements to provide our own legal opinion that the law was constitutional. And then again, with work trying to implement the clean heat standard, we were also involved. And it's really important. I agree. It's really important that we continue to work to meet the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act and the specific plan that was laid out for us by the Climate Council in the Vermont Climate Action Plan. It's all there for us to move ahead with. Unfortunately, TCI is gone, and the clean heat standard has suffered a major blow this past session. We're going to have a whole new legislature with a lot of new people coming in January. And I think what we need is bold, decisive, and experienced leadership to make sure that the legislature has what it needs to move ahead with the ideas put forth in the Climate Action Plan, so that Vermont can make sure that it meets the goals set out, or the targets set out in the Global Warming Solutions Act. I think we're going to, have an opportunity to look again at the clean heat standard. I am looking forward to providing the expertise from the Environmental Division at the Attorney General's office to support the legislature in that work.
In recent years, Vermont's mental health system has struggled to meet demand. At times, that's led to people needing mental health care becoming involved in the criminal justice system. That led to conflict early last year when the Attorney General, Donovan, we filed 3 cases that had previously been dismissed by the Chittenden County State's Attorney based on questions about the defendant's sanity. What steps would you take to address the gaps in the state's mental health care and criminal justice systems? Ms. Clark?
This is an incredibly important question. It's something I think about a lot. And, as you say, what we have now is a criminal justice system that is trying to act as our mental health system, and it's inadequate. We need to make investments in infrastructure and thoughtful investments about how to support people who are in mental health crisis. I also think we have, a lot of rays of hope in our office. We have a court diversion and pretrial services, and those practices that have been going on for decades are really important. What we have is an approach that treats people as a whole person and not just as the crime. I think that's what we need to do going forward in that space. More of that. It works. It's effective. We need more restorative justice, and that model is just more effective. In terms of the mental health system, I'll point out that the Attorney General's office's Human Services Division has lawyers at the Department of Mental Health and provides support to the Department of Mental Health. It's incredibly important work between the mental health portion of the AG's office, the criminal portion of the AG's office, the community justice portion of the AG's office, we certainly have expertise and a voice. And as Attorney General, I will ensure that we have a seat at the table, because it's just incredibly important that we work toward problem solving on this issue.
Mr. Tebow?
So this isn't an area where it needs to be a seat at the table. There needs to be, I think, someone calling out the crisis that we have. Right now, our emergency departments are de facto mental health treatment facilities in the state. That leads to all kinds of conflict. ER workers are repeatedly being assaulted or injured, trying to deal with patients that are beyond the scope of what they can deal with in a triage setting. So there's a huge capacity problem in mental health. I think it's no secret that we have a workforce crisis. We also have a systems crisis. Right now, the Department of Mental Health has very limited options of what to do with dangerous offenders who are found incompetent or insane through a court process. And these are the people who have, as the three cases you noted, this is where people have been harmed or killed. And we need to have a forensic unit made available in the state. There's a working group on this now, but quite frankly, it's not working fast enough. We have people in crisis right now who need to be taken out of jail and put in a facility where their needs can be met, while we can also assure public safety. At the lower level, I've been a huge advocate of embedding social workers and other community supports with law enforcement. I would applaud Chief Brian Pete in Montpelier, who's been a leader on bringing a crisis intervention team model to Washington County. It's that type of thoughtfulness, coupled with programs like Team 2, that are integral to breaking the chain between mental health crisis and the criminal justice system. Putting these workers on the front lines is the best and most cost-effective way that we can intervene early and avoid individuals suffering an illness from entering the criminal justice system in the first place.
Thank you both. In recent months, Vermont has seen a series of crimes committed against individuals for their gender identity or sexual orientation, and against organizations who represent the LGBTQ+ community. What more do you believe the Attorney General's office should be doing to investigate and prosecute these incidents and prevent them from happening in the first place? Mr. Tebow?
So just to start with, this has been an absolutely terrible year for the LGBTQIA community here in Vermont. And then looking at, for example, Justice Thomas's concurring opinion in Dobbs, it's undoubtable that there was coming, another right-wing assault is coming on gender-affirming care for trans persons, and just there's a drive to increase the stigma and othering of people who are different than what some would believe people should be or ought to be. I find it absolutely unacceptable. In terms of a system response, we have effective laws in the books, but those laws are only effective when there are people willing to enforce them. We can't be cautious or only bring cases in these matters to trial when we think we can win or when we think it's convenient, I guess, for the state. I think there needs to be more training at the local level in law enforcement, more advocacy work done to make sure that we have victim advocates and personnel on the ground who can help individuals navigate the legal process. We often talk about disparities in the criminal justice system from an offender-centric view. I think we need to also, if Attorney General, I'd want to make sure that statewide we're looking at disparities from a victim-centric view, because it's not easy to be a victim in Vermont to begin with. It's much more difficult to be a victim in Vermont when you're a person of color or when you're part of the LGBTQIA community. The supports and opportunities available may not be there as they are for more privileged Vermonters.
Thank you, Ms. Clark.
I want to start by saying these were incredibly upsetting and despicable events and crimes that occurred this year. And I think it's a time when we need to hold LGBTQ folks in our hearts. We need to amplify their voices. We need to do everything we can to protect them. And as Attorney General, I'm aware of the opportunities that the office has because I was Chief of Staff for 4 years. We have a civil rights unit with incredible expertise. We have worked in the past to support legislation that supported the LGBTQ community. I was personally involved in that, and I think it's just incredibly important that we listen to that community and make sure that they know we are here supporting them. One of the opportunities of the Attorney General's office and the Attorney General role is to amplify messages, to be the bold voice, to be the loud voice. and make sure that a light is shined on issues that otherwise might not get our attention. So in terms of, specifically what we can do, I think as a starting point, we need to embrace and hold up the members of our community who identify as LGBTQ and make sure that they know we have their back and we're going to fight for them. I think it's important to make sure that folks are educated as well. And in the Attorney General's office, it's important that appropriate training is done to ensure the workforce at the AG's office has, the skills and the training to be the voice and to be supportive of the LGBTQ community.
Do you support safe injection or overdose prevention sites? What other harm reduction measures do you think the Attorney General's office should be taking to address the opioid epidemic? Ms. Clark?
I don't think anyone in the state has gone untouched by the opioid crisis. It is devastating. Each of us has a story, a neighbor, a family member, a friend. It is heartbreaking. And I think to do nothing is not an option. The Attorney General's office obviously has been involved in our role of representing the state in legal matters with suing opioid companies, those who were involved with the opioid crisis and were the cause of this opioid crisis. In terms of overdose prevention sites, my view on this and my position has been that if a local community wants an overdose prevention site, so long as we have, a state's attorney in the Attorney General's office, and of course the federal government is agreeing not to prosecute. And we have those wraparound services like mental health treatment and substance use treatment. And we have a community partner who's willing to host the site. I would support the overdose prevention site.
Mr. Tebow?
So I'll just say that I have no conceptual opposition whatsoever to Vermont having overdose prevention sites implemented, but I don't think it's right to push this out to individuals to take the risk or municipalities to take the risk. We need leadership on this issue. In the Vermont Digger questionnaire, I logged a no answer. It's a no, but. I think the answer we just heard was a yes, but. I have significant concerns. We need to make sure that the individuals who are doing this work and on the front lines of preventing another overdose death are not subject to retribution by a hostile Department of Health here in the state of Vermont, that they are not subject to a change in leadership that leads to prosecution or being shut down. We need to make sure that this is done right. It is a big issue that has been completed successfully in some small jurisdictions around the United States, mostly in cities. To take a statewide approach, I think requires due diligence in making sure that we are doing it the right way. So I think the path we're on now is figuring out how to do that right, how to protect patients, how to protect workers, and how to make sure that we navigate this, because we need to thread the needle and get it right to not put more people at risk. From a harm reduction standpoint, it was a shame that Governor Scott vetoed H728. There were a number of means in there that are not controversial: increasing access to clean needles, removing barriers for insurance to go to inpatient treatment, and ultimately allowing for greater access to care and intervention. It should be consistent with Vermont. I think it was vetoed just because it had the word overdose prevention site in it, which is a shame. If we can't talk about this issue, we're never going to make progress.
We'll now return to candidate questions. Same rules as before. Ask a question, please avoid speeches, and 90-second responses to the questions, 30 seconds for follow-ups. Mr. Tebow first.
Well, I'm going to pull an audible. I had a question written out, but the last topic really gave me something to talk about. So I was fortunate enough to be part of this Vermont Sentencing Commission and worked on H505, which proposed to reform Vermont's drug sentencing laws. So my question is, would you support H505 as it was originally proposed? And if not, what would you do differently?
I appreciate the question, Rory, but I don't have H505 in front of me. You're going to have to describe more what you mean. Sorry. I'm familiar with that because we testified on it, but I don't have that reviewing it.
So the original draft of H505 proposed to defelonize personal use amounts of heroin and cocaine, remove the distinction between powder cocaine and crack cocaine for trafficking, And the final bill, or the bill also had added on the study of decriminalization of personal use amounts of drugs in the state of Vermont.
So just my view generally on decriminalization of drugs is I think that when we talk about that, what we're really talking about is treatment and decriminalization. And that's what makes it work. It's the treatment. This is the most important part of drug decriminalization is the treatment. People need mental health services. They need, drug addiction services. They need job services. They need healthcare services. Without those wraparound services, treatment and decriminalization doesn't work. I don't think that we are in a place in Vermont where we have the support needed to make decriminalization of drugs work. It's got to be treatment and decriminalization. That said, I believe strongly we need to move away from a punitive model to a treatment model. We have had 50 years of the war on drugs, and for 50 years, it has not worked. We have a crisis in Vermont on this topic. It's incredibly important that we support infrastructure to provide treatment.
Mr. Tebow, do you have a follow-up to that?
I do, and it's a little bit collateral with the Sentencing Commission. So one of the things is, the Attorney General gets to do is send a lot of attorneys or representatives to different study committees or commissions or rulemaking boards. Some of the work in the Sentencing Commission was frustrated because the Attorney General's representatives would frequently say that they were not authorized to make decisions at that committee, despite there being announced votes. Would you empower your representatives to rulemaking boards, commissions, and other bodies to act on your behalf if elected Attorney General, or would you reserve decision-making to yourself?
It sounds like if there was a notice of a vote being taken, that needs to happen. There needs to be preparation. And if there's approval on a specific topic required by the Attorney General in the management of the office, I think that that needs to take place. I would certainly work very hard as Attorney General to make sure that communication is flowing quickly to make sure that we're not holding up a sentencing commission or any other board or commission that the Attorney General has a designee on. My leadership style is very collaborative, and I think it's really important to be responsive and to take seriously the role of serving on these boards and commissions.
Ms. Clark, your question for Mr. Tebow.
Sorry, found it. One of the most important cases that we filed when I was Attorney General, when I was Chief of Staff at the Attorney General's office, was our lawsuit against the fossil fuel company. And that used the Consumer Protection Act to sue the industry for essentially greenwashing in a nutshell. How would you use the Attorney General's office to address global warming?
That's a great question. And I think that, there are two parts to this. So when we're looking at, greenwashing or responding to the climate crisis, there's both a consumer end to this, and there's also an environmental end. And this is one of those areas where I think siloing the different divisions of the Attorney General's office isn't beneficial. So a lot of this boils down to where there's opportunity for intervention is looking what our utilities are doing here in the state of Vermont and looking at what they're trying to do to ratepayers. I have immense concern that a lot of the greening of our economy is going to come on the back of Vermont's working class. That's untenable, where we're going to have many of the people who are most directly impacted by climate change paying the cost, while we have some Vermonters who fly in private jets or take ski vacations in Vail. That's just really not how we need to work through this. So in terms of using the power of the Attorney General's office, I think we need to have a view that balances both protecting Vermonters, especially our workers and elders, with the reality that we need to take decisive action. And making those choices, I don't doubt that it is very difficult to do that. But I take great faith in knowing that within the Attorney General's office, particularly in the environmental division and within consumer protection, I had coffee with a former Attorney General not long ago who gave me a great metaphor. And it was, when you have a stable full of thoroughbreds, you've got to let them run. And that's the attitude I have. We talked a little bit about leadership approach. I would like to delegate and allow the experts in the office the latitude to pursue cases that they believe advance the interest of all Vermonters.
Ms. Clark, do you have a follow-up?
I do not.
Perfect. Our final segment tonight will be a lightning round. Each of you will have a chance to answer these questions, but please do so in just a few words. First up, do you support prosecutors ending the use of cash bail? Mr. Tebow?
Not fully.
Ms. Clark?
I believe we need to move to a risk-based system for bail.
Could you specify a little bit more?
Right now, it's based on financial ability, and I think it should be based on risk assessment.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that.
If I could respond briefly to that. So cash bail is only used in Vermont to mitigate risk of flight. It has nothing to do with actual risk to the community or public, which I think is a broad misconception. I think COVID has done more for reducing the use of bail than really a lot of legislative reforms could have. And my office follows a policy of using it only when absolutely necessary.
Next question. Should Vermont end qualified immunity for law enforcement officers? Ms. Clark?
The legislature looked at, I'm sorry, I'll be quick. There's a memo coming from Legislative Council this fall that I'm looking forward to reading and seeing what it says so we can move ahead in January.
And Mr. Tebow?
No, I think our efforts on law enforcement accountability need to be directed towards the individual. For example, Vermont lacks an excessive use of force criminal statute. It's steps like this, along with strengthening our responses to bad cops, that will have a bigger impact on conduct.
Do you support eliminating life without parole sentences? Mr. Tebow?
I would follow Attorney General Donovan's model and position on that, which I think there should be a review on second and first degree murder after 35 years, the presumptive minimum for first degree, and to maintain it as an option in cases of aggravated murder. But for murder in first and second degree, I believe life without parole should no longer be the maximum penalty.
Ms. Clark?
I take the same approach, but I would say that it would be looking forward and not backward in time.
Do you plan to enter the courtroom and prosecute your own cases should you become Attorney General? Ms. Clark?
No, I would assign, as the leader of the office, that's not generally what the Attorney General does. I've never seen the Attorney General do that. You want to get the best person on every case, and that's not the role of the Attorney General. They are the vision setter and the leader of the office.
Mr. Tebow?
I think there's some cases where the personal appearance of the Attorney General sends a message, and obviously I'm no stranger to the courtroom. I would enter my appearance if it was appropriate.
The previous Attorney General left office to accept a job that involves lobbying state policymakers. Do you believe that move was appropriate? And would you support restrictions on how quickly an Attorney General can enter a lobbying role after leaving his or her post, Mr. Tebow?
Well, first I'll note that my younger son thought it would be much cooler if I was going to work at Roblox than at the Attorney General's office. So I'll note that, but I think there should be broad ethics restrictions for all state government employees leaving. Federal government has comparable rules. We can't have a revolving door, even though Montpelier is a small place.
Ms. Clark?
Can you repeat the question, please?
The previous Attorney General left office to accept a job that involves lobbying state policymakers. Do you believe that move was appropriate? And would you support restrictions on how quickly an Attorney General can enter a lobbying role after leaving office?
We have ethical rules in place right now, and I think that they're working, and I wouldn't change them at this moment in time. So I think that was appropriate.
You think that they are working even though the former Attorney General went into a lobbying role immediately after leaving office?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I mean, the ethical rules don't cover that. I think that's okay.
Okay. Who is another state or federal Attorney General who you look up to and would like to emulate? Ms. Clark?
Well, I've been fortunate to work under two Attorneys General, Bill Sorrell and TJ Donovan. Both of them were, incredible leaders, and I learned a lot from them. I will say that this is too long. I'm sorry. When I was working in Governor Dean's office, Justice Amistoy made a really big impression on me with the decision that required the legislature to provide marriage equality to Vermonters.
Mr. Tebow?
I look to somebody who's no longer an attorney general, but Senator Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, I think, set a good model of being a proactive attorney general. And currently, I think Attorney General Maura Healey in Massachusetts is another excellent leader when looking outside the state of Vermont.
And last question, we'd like to ask you each to name one policy you plan to lead advocacy efforts for in the legislature. Mr. Tebow?
You know, just having to pick one is really difficult. There are so many, challenges we face. I think right now I would really like to focus. I think in the next year, we need to come up with the policies and be a partner to the legislature in terms of defending reproductive liberties.
And Ms. Clark?
Yes, that's really important. I think I'm going to say the same. It's really historic that a fundamental right was taken from us, and it's incredibly important that we do everything we can to protect the rights that we have here and those of our fellow Americans.
All right, that concludes Vermont Digger's Democratic Attorney General debate. Please stay tuned to vermontdigger.org to learn about upcoming events in the 2022 Digger Debate Series. I would like to thank both candidates for joining us tonight, as well as the VTDigger staffers who made this possible, including Mike Doherty, Paul Heinz, Natalie Williams, Kate Olney, Libby Johnson, and Taylor Haynes. I'd also like to thank the Neckerson Group once again for sponsoring our debate tonight. You'll find our 2022 election guide at vermontdigger.org/elections. And to support our coverage of Vermont government and politics, please visit vtdigger.org/donate. Thank you again, and good night.
All right, we all set, Alan?